There is a particular kind of embarrassment that does not announce itself until it is already too late to do anything useful about it. It does not arrive with warning or preparation. It simply appears, fully formed, in the middle of a candlelit dining room that is not yours, surrounded by faces that do not know you, beneath a ceiling high enough to swallow sound and pride in equal measure. Cecily Ashworth knew this with absolute and devastating certainty on the evening of the 14th of April, 1815, when she walked through the wrong door, sat in the wrong chair, and looked up to find a man staring at her from across a table set for 12, with an expression she could not immediately name, but would spend a very long time afterward attempting to forget. She had not meant to attend the Duke of Wyndmere's private dinner. She had meant to attend Lady Forsyth's musicale, which was being held 2 doors down in the same terraced row of townhouses along Cavendish Square, and which was the sort of gentle, harmless event that a woman of Cecily's quiet circumstances could attend without anyone particularly noticing her arrival or her departure. She had accepted Lady Forsyth's invitation 3 weeks ago with the modest gratitude of a woman who did not receive many invitations and was careful to honor the ones that came. She had dressed carefully. She had borrowed her cousin's pearl earrings. She had walked the 3 blocks from her lodgings in the October cold with her shawl pulled tight, and her head full of nothing more dangerous than the hope that the evening would be pleasant and that the musicale would be tolerable and that she might have a cup of decent tea before she went home again. She had counted the doors incorrectly. She had been distracted by the lamplight and the sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestones and the small, persistent worry that had lived in her chest for the past 4 months since her father's death, and the attendant unraveling of everything she had previously taken for granted. She had walked up the steps of number 14 instead of number 16. She had handed her shawl to a footman who accepted it without expression because footmen of good households are trained not to show surprise. And she had followed the sound of voices through a beautifully appointed corridor and through a set of open double doors and into a dining room that was unmistakably not Lady Forsyth's. It was too grand for that. Everything about it was too grand. The table was mahogany, long enough to seat a parliament, set with crystal and silver that caught the light of 4 candelabras arranged at precise intervals down its center. The walls were paneled in dark wood, hung with paintings that had the settled, authoritative look of things that have been in a family for generations rather than purchased to impress. There were flowers, pale roses, arranged with the kind of restrained elegance that costs considerably more than flowers that announce their cost. And there were people, 11 of them already seated, dressed in the kind of clothes that required significant staff to put on properly, looking up at her with the varied and collectively terrible expressions of the comfortably arrived observing the unexpectedly arrived. Cecily stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute and was probably 3 seconds. She understood immediately that she had made an error. She also understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in moments of profound mortification, that she was now standing in the private dining room of someone of considerable consequence, and that the footman had already taken her shawl, and that retreating would require walking back through 11 pairs of eyes and asking, somehow, for the shawl to be returned, and that the entire exercise would be sufficiently humiliating as to render itself memorable to everyone present for the remainder of their natural lives. She looked at the table. There was 1 empty seat. It was on the left side, 3 chairs from the head, set with a full service like all the others, clearly expected to be occupied. She had one long, irrational, and entirely unreasonable thought, which was that if she simply sat down, the situation might resolve itself before anyone was required to speak. She sat down. The woman to her left, silver-haired and wearing a necklace of extraordinary emeralds, glanced at her with mild curiosity and said nothing. The man to her right, young and fair-haired and clearly a few glasses of wine ahead of the table, gave her a look of cheerful bewilderment and also said nothing. And from the head of the table, 12 feet away and directly in her sight line, the man she had noticed first and looked away from and could not stop looking back at continued to watch her with that expression she was still failing to name. He was perhaps 32, perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the kind of face that required no arrangement to command attention, not handsome in the soft or decorative sense, but precise, angular, formed with the unsentimental economy of a face that has never needed to work at being noticed. His coat was perfectly cut, His cravat was tied without excess. He sat at the head of his own table the way certain men sit, not performing ease, but actually inhabiting it, with the authority of someone who has never had to wonder whether the room would arrange itself around him, because it always has. He was also still staring at her. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Cecily Ashworth was 26 years old, the daughter of a classicist who had died in February with more debts than manuscripts and more manuscripts than money, leaving her with a small annuity from her late mother's estate, a rented room above a bookshop on Marylebone Street, and the particular quiet independence of a woman who has learned to manage on considerably less than she had been raised to expect. She was not, by the standards of the world she had grown up on the fringes of, a remarkable woman. She was not beautiful in the way that drew rooms to stillness. She was not connected to anyone of consequence. She had no title, no fortune, no powerful relations eager to sponsor her. She had read everything her father had ever owned, which was substantial, and she had a mind that her father had always said was wasted on a world that didn't know where to put it, which had been his version of a compliment, and which she had accepted as such because she loved him and because he was usually right. She had brown eyes and dark hair and the particular posture of a woman who has learned that good posture costs nothing and concedes nothing. And on this specific evening, she had borrowed pearl earrings and worn her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that had been let out once and altered twice, and which fit well enough in the light of a single candle. Under the light of 4 candelabras and the gaze of 12 strangers and one man at the head of the table who had not yet looked anywhere else, it fit adequately. The soup arrived. This struck Cecily as, in its way, merciful. The arrival of soup required the attention of the room to redirect itself toward eating, which was a more private activity than staring, and during which she might formulate some plan of action that went beyond simply sitting here and hoping the situation evolved favorably on its own. She picked up the correct spoon, because her father had always insisted she learn the correct spoon, and she looked at the soup, and she thought, with the methodical practicality she had learned to apply to catastrophe, about what exactly she was going to do. She could excuse herself and leave. This was the obvious solution, the sensible solution, the solution that any reasonable woman would have chosen at the moment she sat down, before the soup arrived, before the footman filled her wine glass with a confidence that suggested he had been instructed to fill all glasses at this table and intended to discharge that instruction regardless of the glass's owner's qualifications to be here. The difficulty was that the moment for leaving quietly had passed. Leaving now would require standing up and walking the full length of the room and explaining herself to a man at the head of the table who she was becoming increasingly certain was, by the quality of his silver and the behavior of his staff, a man of very significant rank indeed. She would have to account for herself. She would have to say aloud, in front of 11 people whose names she did not know, that she had walked into the wrong house and taken a seat at a stranger's dinner table and sat through the soup course before choosing to mention it. She picked up her spoon. The soup was excellent. The woman with the emeralds introduced herself as Lady Hartmore, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has been making introductions for 40 years and sees no reason to make them interesting. The fair-haired young man was Mr. Albright, a nephew of someone, vague on the specifics, enthusiastic on the wine. There was a general, gradual, politely orchestrated distribution of conversation around the table, the kind that happens at dinners where the host is sufficiently practiced to ensure that no one sits in silence and no one is required to be genuinely interesting. It was competent and it was professional, and it created, for approximately 20 minutes, the impression that Cecily was simply a guest like any other guest, present because she was expected and expected because she was welcome. And then the host spoke to her directly. His voice was low and carried across the table without effort in the way that voices do when they are accustomed to carrying. It did not require volume. It simply arrived. "Miss," he said, "I am afraid I am at a disadvantage. I don't believe we have been introduced." The table, with the finely tuned social instinct of people who have spent their lives at tables like this one, managed to continue its various conversations while simultaneously becoming entirely attentive to this one. Cecily set down her spoon. She looked at the man at the head of the table, up close or closer than she had been. which was still 12 feet, and a candlelit void. His eyes were dark, and there was in them something she was now beginning to name, not anger, not bewilderment, but something more careful than either of those. Something that watched and measured with the patient attention of a man who does not rush to conclusions because he has learned that conclusions reached in haste are frequently wrong. "No," she said. "We haven't. I apologize for that. My name is Cecily Ashworth." She paused for exactly 1 moment. "I believe I may have walked into the wrong house." The silence that followed was the specific and magnificent silence of 11 people exercising extraordinary self-control. The man at the head of the table looked at her for a moment that lasted somewhat longer than a moment. Then, to her complete bewilderment, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not precisely a smile. It was the very beginning of one, contained and controlled, and gone almost before it arrived, as though he had noticed it himself and decided it required management. "How far wrong?" he said. "2 doors," Cecily said. "I was attempting to reach Lady Forsyth's musicale." "Number 16, said Lady Hartmore, helpfully. "This is number 14. "Yes," Cecily agreed. "I see that now." There was another pause. Then the man at the head of the table said, with a measured and entirely unreadable courtesy, "Miss Ashworth, you are welcome to remain for dinner, if you have no objection to the company." He looked at her steadily. "Or I can have your shawl returned to you and arrange a carriage to number 16. Whichever you prefer." Cecily thought about Lady Forsyth's musicale. She thought about the cold October evening and the 3 blocks of walking and the borrowed earrings and the careful preparation and the modest hope for a cup of decent tea. She thought about the fact that she was sitting at a table where the soup was the best thing she had eaten in 4 months, and the wine in her glass was the kind of wine she had not tasted since before her father died, and that the alternative was a musicale at which no one had been particularly expecting her anyway. "I have no objection to the company," she said. "If you have no objection to the irregularity." This time the almost smile lasted a fraction longer before it was recalled to order. "I find," said the man at the head of the table, "that the evening has become considerably more interesting in the last 10 minutes. Please stay, Miss Ashworth." His name was Julian Cavendish. She learned it from Lady Hartmore, who supplied it in an undertone between courses with the particular relish of a woman sharing information she expects to be found significant, and who was rewarded when. Cecily's expression remained composed by exactly the effort of will it required to keep it there. Julian Cavendish, 8th Duke of Wyndmere, of the Wyndmere estates in Cumberland, the townhouse in Cavendish Square which explained the street, she thought, and then thought that she should perhaps have noticed the street name sooner, and the family seat at Ardenmere in Westmoreland, which was described in sufficient superlatives in Lady Hartmore's account, that Cecily formed the impression of a place that existed primarily to impress people who were already impressed by most things. He was 33, Lady Hartmore continued, warming to her subject. He had held the title for 8 years, since his father's death. He had a reputation in Parliament for being thorough to the point of inconvenience, and for taking positions that cost him socially when he thought those positions were correct, which some people found admirable and others found exhausting. He was not married. He had been, Lady Hartmore said with the lowered voice of someone transmitting the important part, nearly engaged twice, but both times the arrangement had dissolved before it reached conclusion. The circumstances were variously described by the world as mysterious, unfortunate, and, by those who made it their business to construct explanations for everything, inevitable, since the Duke of Wyndmere was known to be a man of exacting standards and minimal patience for performance. What Lady Hartmore did not say, because some things are communicated through tone rather than content, was that Julian Cavendish was the kind of man whom society held in a particular kind of respect that is adjacent to fear. Not because he was cruel or unjust, but because he was consistent. He did not pretend to find things acceptable that he did not find acceptable. He did not arrange his face to produce the expressions that occasions demanded if those expressions were not genuine. He was known to be fair and to be cold, and to be more intelligent than most of the people he shared rooms with, and he had the manner, cultivated or innate, of a man who has never needed anything from anyone in the room and knows it, and is not unkind about it, but is entirely clear. Cecily listened to all of this and ate her fish course and said, "He seems a formidable person." "He is," said Lady Hartmore with some satisfaction. "Which is why everyone at this table, myself included, is watching to see how you handle yourself. I walked into his house by accident and ate his soup, Cecily said. I don't think handling myself is a concept that applies at this point. Lady Hartmore laughed, a genuine sound, brief and surprised. My dear, she said, you handled yourself perfectly. You told him the truth immediately and without embellishment, and you gave him the choice. Most women in that position would have spent the entire meal hoping he wouldn't notice. I considered it, Cecily admitted. But the soup was too good not to explain myself. Lady Hartmore laughed again and decided, apparently on the basis of this exchange, to become something like an ally for the remainder of the evening. Cecily was aware of the Duke throughout dinner in the way that one is aware of a fire in a room, not because one is staring at it constantly, but because it occupies a fixed point in one's peripheral consciousness and cannot be entirely dismissed. He conversed with the man on his right with the attentiveness of someone who listens properly rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He spoke with the woman on his left, a thin, sharp-featured woman who seemed to disagree with him about something. And he disagreed back with the calm certainty of a man who has examined a position and found it sound and is not significantly moved by opposition. He managed the table with the competence of a host who does not make hosting look like management. And approximately once every quarter hour, his attention came to rest on her, briefly, with that same careful, measuring quality that she was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend not to notice. The third time it happened, she looked back directly, because looking away felt like an admission of something she wasn't prepared to admit. He did not look away either. They held the look for one long beat that contained, she was certain, an entire conversation neither of them was in a position to have. And then the man to his right said something, and the look ended, and Cecily returned her attention to her plate and the roasted pheasant upon it, which required, she told herself firmly, her full and undivided focus. The conversation at dinner covered 3 general territories. There was the war, which was not quite over, the campaigns in the peninsula that everyone followed and most people had opinions about, and some people at this table had personal stakes in, younger brothers in regiments, investments in supply contracts, political allies whose careers depended on outcomes. There was Parliament, specifically the debate around the Corn Laws that had been occupying the better part of the previous session and which divided the table more or less along the lines one might predict, the landed interests on one side, a skeptical minority on the other. And there was the more personal territory of London, its current season, its fashions and rumors, and the particular social arithmetic of who was where and with whom, and to what probable end. Cecily had views on all 3 subjects. She had spent 4 months living quietly above a bookshop reading everything she could find and thinking about the world with the particular intensity of a person who has had a great deal taken away and is determining what remains. And what remained was a mind that had never been given enough to do and was not about to become quieter simply because her circumstances had become harder. She had opinions about the conduct of the war that she had formed by reading dispatches and military history and the letters her father's friends had sent from the continent. She had opinions about the Corn Laws that she had formed by reading economic theory and thinking about the people she saw every day in the streets around her lodgings, the bread price, and what it meant to a family whose income did not move when the price did. She kept most of these opinions to herself. She was at the wrong table at the wrong dinner, and she had already introduced enough irregularity into the evening without adding a woman with political opinions to the list of its peculiarities. She answered what was asked of her, and listened well, and spoke when the conversation came near enough to her that silence would have been more conspicuous than brevity, and she thought she was managing the exercise with something approaching reasonable skill. And then Mr. Albright, who had moved from cheerful to expansive over the course of the fish and the pheasant, and was now approaching something that might generously be described as philosophical, turned to her and asked, with the broad goodwill of a man who includes everyone in a room in his opinions, what she thought of the Corn Laws proposal. The table, sensitized now to the question of what Cecily Ashworth thought about things, quieted slightly. She could have deflected. She was aware of the option. She could have said something modest and uninformative and redirected the question to someone more qualified by rank or connection to hold an opinion on public matters. She was quite sure that was the sensible approach and that any number of women in her position would have taken it without a second thought. She said, I think the proposal protects the profits of landowners at the direct expense of people who have no land, and therefore no ability to absorb the cost of artificially elevated bread prices. I think the argument that it protects English agriculture is technically accurate and practically a justification for ensuring that a particular class of person remains comfortable while a different class of person goes hungry. And I think that any parliament that passes it will spend the next decade discovering exactly how many people can be made hungry before hunger becomes a problem for everyone. The silence that followed this was of a different quality than the silence after her earlier announcement. That silence had been surprised. This one was something more complex. Lady Hartmore looked at her with an expression that might have been approval and might have been alarm, and was possibly both. Mr. Albright, to his credit, did not look offended. He looked, if anything, more alert than he had been all evening, as though someone had said something interesting in his vicinity and he was trying to catch up with it. From the head of the table, the Duke of Wyndmere said, "And what do you base that assessment on?" His tone was not challenging. It was genuinely interrogative, the voice of a man who has asked a question because he wants to know the answer. "Bread prices over the last 30 years, Cecily said. And Adam Smith. And the reports of the Select Committee from 1813, which I found more informative than the summary suggested." There was a pause. "You read the Select Committee report," the Duke said. "My father was a classicist," Cecily said. "He owned everything. I read everything he owned." Another pause. Then Julian Cavendish said, with the careful deliberateness of a man examining a piece of information and finding it more substantial than expected, "And what did you make of Mr. Malthus's position on the question?" What followed was not, properly speaking, a dinner conversation. It was something more like a sustained exercise in two people discovering, with increasing and mutually disconcerting clarity, that the other person's mind was both larger and more interesting than the evening had given them reason to expect. The table resumed its own conversations around the edges of this one, and Lady Hartmore watched with unconcealed interest, and Mr. Albright listened with the engaged bewilderment of a man following a discussion in a language he mostly understands. The Duke of Wyndmere argued the Malthusian position with more genuine conviction than Cecily had expected, and she disagreed with specific sections of it, and agreed with others, and said which parts and why. And he pushed back on two of her objections with arguments she had not considered, and she thought about them, and said which parts held, and which parts she remained unconvinced by and why. And he listened to her reasons with the particular quality of attention she had noticed at the start of the evening, the attention that is actually paying attention rather than performing it. They were still debating it when the dessert was removed and the candles had burned lower and the table had shifted into the comfortable, loosened ease of a dinner reaching its natural end. Cecily was aware, distantly, that she had been here for 3 hours. She was also aware, somewhat more immediately, that she had spent those 3 hours at a stranger's table as a guest who had arrived as an accident and was being treated as an intention, and that the distance between the head of the table and her seat had somehow become less of a distance than it had felt at the beginning. When the party began to rise and the evening began to formally conclude, Julian Cavendish came around the table. She had not expected him to. She had expected the footman and her shawl and a polite, final dismissal. Instead, the Duke of Wyndmere walked the length of his own dining room and stood before her with the easy authority of a man who goes where he intends to go, and said, at a volume that was for her alone, "I owe you an apology, Miss Ashworth." She looked at him directly. Up close, he was both more and less imposing than the length of the table had suggested. More, because the quality of his attention at this distance was considerable. Less, because there was something in his face, at the end of an evening, when the performance of hosting had relaxed its claims on him, that was unexpectedly human. Something tired, perhaps. Something that had been working hard for a long time at maintaining an appearance of not working hard at all. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You were kind enough to let me stay." "I owe you an apology," he repeated, "because I allowed this dinner to continue without giving you a proper introduction to anyone, which means you spent 3 hours in a room full of strangers knowing none of their names except the two Lady Hartmore told you between courses." He paused. "She told you who I was." "She did. And you didn't leave." The pheasant was excellent. The corner of his mouth moved again, further this time, enough to be called something. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I would like to know, before you go, whether I might call on you properly, if you have a direction you're willing to give. The room was mostly empty now, the other guests moving through the corridor toward cloaks and carriages and the appropriate exits. Lady Hartmore, passing on her way out, slowed fractionally, and then moved on with the discretion of a woman who knows when to keep walking. Cecily thought about the room above the bookshop on Marylebone Street. She thought about what it meant for the Duke of Wyndmere to call on a woman in a room above a bookshop. She thought about the 4 months since her father's death and the careful management of each day and the borrowed earrings and the wrong door. I live above a bookshop, she said, because it seemed important to establish the circumstances plainly. On Marylebone Street. My father left debts, and I have a modest annuity, and the situation is exactly what that description suggests. I understand the description, Julian Cavendish said. He looked at her steadily, and his voice was entirely even. I am asking whether I may call, not on your circumstances. There was a quality in the way he said it that was difficult to account for. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet. But the unmistakable intention of sincerity, the thing that some people perform and some people simply are, and she had spent enough of her life around her father's colleagues, men who performed intelligence and men who possessed it, to know the difference without being able always to articulate how she knew. You may call, she said. On Tuesdays or Thursdays, between 2 and 4. That is when I am generally at home. Tuesday, he said, with the decisiveness of a man who does not see the point in waiting for Thursday. I will be there at 2. He returned her shawl himself, which was not the done thing, and which she suspected he was perfectly aware of, and she walked out into the October evening with her mind full of things that did not assemble themselves neatly into any category she had previously maintained. She had been to the wrong house. She had sat at the wrong table. She had eaten the Duke of Wyndmere's pheasant and argued with him about Adam Smith and the Corn Laws and the epistemological problems of Malthusian population theory, and he had listened to every word of it with the focused attention of a man who does not often listen and was finding, to his apparent surprise, that he wanted to. She walked the 3 blocks home in the cold October night and told herself, with the practiced practicality of a woman who has learned not to build expectations from materials too fragile to bear the weight, that Tuesday would come, and either he would appear or he would not, and she would be sensible about it either way, and that the evening had been, regardless of whatever followed, the most unexpectedly alive she had felt in 4 months. She did not tell herself anything else. She was too sensible for that. She thought about it anyway. The room above the bookshop on Marylebone Street was small and full of light in the mornings, and full of the smell of paper and binding glue and the faint particular sweetness of old books rising through the floorboards from the shop below. Cecily had lived here since March, when the creditors had finished their work on her father's estate, and what remained had been packed into 3 trunks and carried to this address by a carter who had been kind about it. She had 2 rooms, a sitting room with a window that looked out over the street and a bedroom that looked out over a narrow yard where the bookshop's owner kept a brown cat, named Aristotle, who caught mice with philosophical indifference. She had her father's books, the ones that had not been sold to cover the debts, which were the ones the creditors had not recognized as valuable and which were therefore, in their own ironic fashion, the best ones. She had a writing desk that had been her mother's and a chair that had been reupholstered twice, and her own plain good china, and the small annuity from her mother's family that paid the rent on the 2 rooms and the meals that Mrs. Beale, the bookshop owner's wife, brought up each day in exchange for a small additional consideration, and which were simple but consistent and adequate. She had made a life here that was smaller than what she had been raised to expect and larger, in certain essential ways, than she had feared. She read. She walked. She occasionally visited the few acquaintances who remained after 4 months of polite attrition for acquaintances. She had discovered, have a tendency to fade when circumstances change, and there is nothing useful to be gained from the maintenance of the connection. She wrote letters to her father's friends in Oxford, some of whom were genuinely interested in how she was getting on, and some of whom were interested in how her father's papers were getting on, and treated her as a useful conduit to the manuscripts rather than a person in her own right. She did not, particularly, mind this. She had grown accustomed to being invisible to people who were looking past her at something they found more interesting. On Monday evening, which was the evening before Tuesday, she sat at her mother's writing desk and tried to read and thought about the Duke of Wyndmere instead, with the resigned practicality of someone who has given up pretending not to think about something and is now thinking about it efficiently, so as to be finished with it. He would not come. That was the rational probability. Men of his rank did not call on women in rooms above bookshops on Marylebone Street. It was not done, and it served no purpose that she could identify, because she had no social utility to offer him, no connections worth cultivating, no family willing to receive him that might produce useful alliance. She was no one, by the measurements the world applied to such assessments, and no one was not a category that generally attracted the attention of the 8th Duke of Wyndmere except as a curiosity. Briefly, before the demands of being the 8th Duke of Wyndmere reasserted themselves, and the curiosity was replaced by something more appropriate to his station. She had been a curiosity. She knew how to recognize it. She had spent enough years being her father's daughter, interesting to his colleagues because of her mind and invisible to the rest of the world because she was attached to nothing that made her visible, to know the texture of being found interesting in a way that did not quite constitute being seen. Tuesday arrived with cold sunshine and a wind that rattled the windows above the bookshop and made Aristotle retire to the interior of the yard with his tail carried in a manner suggesting personal affront. Cecily did not dress specially. She told herself this with some firmness while putting on the blue wool dress she had worn the night before because it was the best thing she owned, and she told herself again while pinning her hair with somewhat more care than a Tuesday afternoon at home generally required. And she was still telling herself this at 1:05 when she sat down in the chair by the window with a book and did not read a single word of it for the following 55 minutes. The knock at the street door came at 2 o'clock precisely. The knock at the street door came at 2 o'clock precisely. Cecily heard it from her chair by the window, where she had been not reading for the better part of an hour, and she felt something move through her that she identified, with the brisk self-honesty she applied to most things, as relief. Not excitement. Not the foolish, unguarded leap of a woman who has spent the morning hoping. Relief. The quiet, practical acknowledgement that the thing she had told herself not to expect had happened, and that she could now stop telling herself not to expect it and move forward into whatever the afternoon would actually be. She heard Mrs. Beale's voice at the door below, and then a voice she recognized, low and unhurried, with the particular quality she had been unable to stop hearing in memory since the previous evening. She set down her book. She straightened her spine, which was already straight. She folded her hands in her lap and then unfolded them because folded hands suggested nervousness, and she was not nervous. And then she folded them again because unfolded hands suggested she could not decide what to do with them, which was worse. Mrs. Beale announced him with the bright, slightly breathless formality of a woman who has never previously had occasion to announce a duke and intends to do it justice. Julian Cavendish, 8th Duke of Wyndmere, came through the low doorway of Cecily's sitting room with the automatic adjustment of a tall man in a room with modest ceilings, and stood for a moment in the space that was, she was suddenly aware with new and uncomfortable clarity, very small and very plain and very full of books, and looked at her. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "Please sit down." He sat in the chair across from hers, which was the chair her father had preferred and which bore the impression of habitual occupation in the way of chairs that have been loved by a specific person for a long time. The Duke of Wyndmere sat in it with the composed ease he seemed to bring to all situations, making no visible acknowledgement of the fact that it was a different order of chair from the ones he likely occupied by habit. He looked at the books on the shelves, which covered every wall and had extended to a system of stacked volumes on the floor organized in a way that had logic to it, even if the logic was not immediately apparent to the uninitiated. He looked at the writing desk and the papers on it, and the window, and the view of Marylebone Street below, gray and purposeful in the Tuesday afternoon. He looked at her. "You came," she said, because the silence had become the kind that required acknowledging. "I said I would." "You did. I wasn't entirely certain it would happen." "Did you think I'd forgotten?" he asked. "I thought," she said carefully, "that the distance between Cavendish Square and Marylebone Street might have seemed longer in the light of Tuesday than it did in the light of Monday evening." He considered this. The distance is the same either way. Distances have a way of being different depending on what's at either end of them. He looked at her with the direct, measuring attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things that interested him, not a performance of consideration, but the thing itself. What did you think was at this end, he asked. A woman in 2 rooms above a bookshop with no particular claim on your attention. And yet here I am, he said, with a dryness so complete it was almost not dry at all. Mrs. Beale arrived with tea before Cecily could respond to this, setting the tray with the slightly elevated ceremony she had clearly decided the occasion demanded, using the good china that Cecily had not asked her to use and that Mrs. Beale had apparently decided was appropriate on her own authority. The teapot was Cecily's mother's, white with a thin blue border, and it was the finest thing in the room and also the most personal, and she was aware of it in a way she had not anticipated being aware of it. When Mrs. Beale had gone, Cecily poured the tea with the steadiness of a woman who is not going to let a teapot be the thing that undoes her, and Julian Cavendish accepted his cup and said, without preamble, "Tell me about your father." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you mentioned him last night as the explanation for how you came to read everything you read, and I found the explanation insufficient. It tells me what you read, but not why you read it the way you do. The Select Committee report is not a document that most people finish, let alone form opinions about. I'd like to understand how you came to form yours." Cecily set down her own cup. She thought about her father, about his study in the house in Oxford that had smelled of tobacco and old paper, and the particular intellectual excitement of a man who found the world inexhaustibly interesting. About the way he had never spoken to her as though she were a child or a daughter or a woman, but simply as another mind, available for argument, expected to hold its own, corrected when it was wrong without ceremony and agreed with when it was right without flattery. About the way she had absorbed, over 26 years of being her father's primary conversation partner, a habit of thinking that she had never quite been able to make fit the shape of the world that was available to her. She told him some of this. Not all of it. She told him about her father's method of reading, which was to read everything bearing on a question and then argue about it at dinner until a position emerged that could survive the argument. She told him about the summer she was 16 when she had worked through her father's entire collection on political economy, because it was raining and there was nothing else to do, and had come out the other end with opinions about Ricardo that her father's colleagues had found first amusing and then, grudgingly, worth engaging with. She told him about reading the Select Committee report because her father had a copy and because the summary she had found elsewhere seemed to be missing something and she had wanted to find out what. He listened to all of this with the complete, unhurried attention she had observed at dinner, and asked questions at the points where questions belonged, and the questions were good ones, the kind that pushed rather than redirected, that wanted more of what she was saying rather than a change of subject. As she answered them and they moved, gradually, and without either of them making a decision about it, from her father's method of reading to the specific arguments of the Select Committee to the question of what Parliament was for and what it had been allowed to become and what the difference between those two things cost people who had no representation in the answer. It was the most sustained intellectual conversation Cecily had had in 4 months and possibly longer. She was aware of this, and of the particular quality it gave the afternoon, a kind of charged aliveness that was partly the pleasure of argument and partly something else she was not ready to examine directly. The Duke of Wyndmere argued well. He was not always right, and he did not pretend to be, which was itself a form of intelligence she had learned not to take for granted. He held his positions with the firmness of a man who had formed them on the basis of evidence and would revise them on the same basis. And when she offered a counter-argument that he found compelling, she could see him revise in real time, not with reluctance, but with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been given a better tool for the job and is glad of it. At 3:30 she became aware that the light had changed and that the tea was long cold, and that she had been talking for an hour and a half with the focus and ease of someone who has forgotten to be careful. She stopped herself mid-sentence about agricultural wages and said, "Forgive me. I've been monopolizing the conversation." "You have not," he said. "We've been having a conversation. There's a difference. I tend to get carried away when someone actually wants to argue. Does that happen rarely?" She looked at him. "More rarely than you might expect, yes." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands in a gesture she was beginning to associate with him when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided to say. Then he said, "I've been to a great many dinners, Miss Ashworth. A great many conversations. I have spent the better part of 8 years in rooms full of educated people with opinions about everything, and I can tell you with some authority that the conversation I had last night at my own table with an uninvited guest who had read the Select Committee report was the most interesting one I have had in recent memory. The directness of it was disarming in a way she had not prepared for. She was accustomed to people who approached their meanings obliquely, who wrapped sincerity in enough qualification and social armor that it could be retreated from if it became inconvenient. The Duke of Wyndmere said things plainly, and the plainness of them landed with the weight of objects that had not been padded for transport. "You're very direct," she said. "I find indirectness inefficient. Most people find it polite." "Most people," he said, "use politeness as a way of not saying what they mean. I prefer to say what I mean and be thought rude by people who would rather I didn't." "And what do you mean?" she asked, because the conversation seemed to have arrived somewhere that required the question. He looked at her steadily. "I mean that I am glad you counted the doors wrong. I mean that I intend to come back on Thursday, with your permission, and that I would like very much for the conversation to continue." He paused. "I mean that I am not here because it was the polite thing to do after an irregular situation. I am here because I wanted to be here." She held his gaze and thought about the room above the bookshop and the borrowed earrings and the 4 months of careful management and the fact that the man across from her was the 8th Duke of Wyndmere with estates in Cumberland and Westmoreland and a seat in the House of Lords and absolutely no practical reason to be sitting in her late father's favorite chair drinking cold tea on a Tuesday afternoon on Marylebone Street. "Thursday," she said. 2 o'clock. The corner of his mouth moved. 2 o'clock, he agreed. He came on Thursday. He came the following Tuesday. He came every Tuesday and Thursday through October and into November, arriving at 2 o'clock with the reliability of a man who does not make commitments he does not intend to honor, and each visit lasted precisely as long as the conversation required, which was never less than 2 hours and once. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of November, when they had begun arguing about Burke's reflections, and neither of them had been willing to concede the central point, was nearly 4. Mrs. Beale took to preparing the good china without being asked. Aristotle, the bookshop cat, began appearing at the sitting-room door during the Duke's visits with proprietary regularity, and Julian Cavendish, to Cecily's private amusement, began acknowledging him with the composed seriousness he brought to everything, occasionally directing a quiet remark at the cat in the intervals between arguments that suggested he had decided Aristotle was entitled to an opinion and might as well have it solicited. The world, she knew, was watching. She was not naive enough to imagine otherwise. Lady Hartmore had called twice since the dinner, ostensibly to inquire after her health, but actually, Cecily understood, to observe the situation with the experienced eye of a woman who has seen a great many situations and finds this one particularly worthy of attention. The bookshop owner below, Mr. Beale, had taken to being visible in the shop doorway when the Duke's carriage arrived, not intrusively, but consistently, with the air of a man who is aware that something is happening in his building and intends to be an informed witness to it. And twice Cecily had encountered, on her morning walk, women she knew slightly from the edges of her former social life, who had greeted her with the particular warmth of people who have recently reassessed someone's importance and want credit for the reassessment. She did not discuss any of this with Julian. She discussed it with no one. She thought about it in the evenings after his visits, sitting at her mother's writing desk with the lamp low and the street quiet below, turning the situation over with the same careful, methodical attention she brought to the Select Committee reports and the Burke arguments. She examined it for what it was and what it was not, and what it might become and what it probably would not. She was a practical woman. She had been trained to think clearly, and she thought clearly about this. What it was, a genuine intellectual connection with a man of exceptional mind and considerable social distance, conducted in her sitting room twice a week with cold tea and good arguments and a cat as the only witness. What it was not. Anything she had been given explicit reason to believe was more than it appeared to be. What it might become. She could not determine this without more information, and the information was not yet available. What she probably should not do. Build her expectations on materials too fragile to bear the weight. She told herself this and believed it and continued, with the discipline she had learned in harder months than these, to manage one Tuesday and one Thursday at a time. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was Lady Hartmore who told her about Lady Dorothea Vane. She came on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, wearing her emeralds as though they were morning dress, and carrying the particular energy of a woman in possession of information she considers it her responsibility to share. She sat in the chair that Cecily had begun, privately and without acknowledgement, to think of as Julian's chair, accepted tea with the efficiency of someone who wants the tea dispensed with so the conversation can begin, and said, with the directness that Cecily had found she appreciated in her, "I think you should know that there is talk of a match between Wyndmere and Lady Dorothea Vane." Cecily held her cup steadily. "I see. Lady Dorothea is the second daughter of the Marquess of Ashbourne. She is 22, accomplished, considered very beautiful, and her family connections would be enormously advantageous to Wyndmere's political interests in the northern counties." Lady Hartmore paused. "The Marquess's man of business has been in conversation with Wyndmere's solicitors for the past 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks that had contained 8 Tuesday and Thursday visits, and Burke and the Select Committee and cold tea, and Aristotle positioned at the door with the authority of a household official." "I see," Cecily said again. "I am telling you," Lady Hartmore said, with the firmness of a woman who has decided she is doing this and intends to do it properly, "because I believe you should know it. Not to distress you, to inform you. There is a difference." "Yes," Cecily agreed. "There is. He is coming here twice a week. We argue about political economy." Lady Hartmore looked at her with the composed, entirely unconvinced expression of a woman who has spent 40 years watching people tell themselves what they need to believe and recognizes the activity regardless of its subject matter. "My dear," she said, "I have known Julian Cavendish since he was 12 years old. I attended his father's funeral, and I have observed him at close range for 8 years in his capacity as the Duke of Wyndmere, and I will tell you something about him that is not widely understood." She set down her cup. "He is a man of considerable feeling. He conceals it extremely well because he learned very early that men of his position are not permitted feeling except in the form of duty, and duty is the shape his feeling has been forced to take for most of his adult life. The conversations he is having in this room are not nothing. They are not the idle diversion of a man with an afternoon to fill. But," she paused, and there was genuine care in her voice, "he is also a man who has spent 8 years making decisions based on responsibility rather than inclination, and I cannot tell you with certainty which will govern him in the end." Cecily looked out the window at Marylebone Street, gray and inhabited and entirely indifferent to the situation in the sitting room above it. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "Be careful," Lady Hartmore said. "Not with him. Be careful with yourself." After Lady Hartmore left, Cecily sat for a long time without moving. She thought about the conversation she had just had and the one she had not yet had, and all the conversations between them that were stored now in the particular private place where she kept things she was not examining directly. She thought about Julian Cavendish sitting across from her in her late father's chair and arguing about Burke with the intensity of a man who had temporarily forgotten about everything else in the moments, occasional and unguarded, when he had looked at her with something in his face that she had been carefully not naming. She thought about Lady Dorothea Vane, whom she had never met and about whom she had no feelings except the specific and clarifying feeling of understanding the shape of the situation more clearly than she had before. She was still sitting there when Tuesday came. She had decided, over the intervening days, to say nothing about what Lady Hartmore had told her. Not because she was afraid to speak plainly, but because she did not yet know what speaking plainly would accomplish. He had said nothing to her about Lady Dorothea Vane. He had said nothing to her about the nature or the future of the visits or the question of what, precisely, he was doing in her sitting room twice a week while his solicitors spoke to the Marquess of Ashbourne's man of business. Until he chose to address any of those things, she had nothing to respond to except her own imagination, and she had learned to be suspicious of her imagination when it started arranging evidence into the shape she most wanted it to take. He came at 2 o'clock. He sat down. He accepted his tea. He said, before she could speak, "You're quiet." "I'm often quiet." "Not in the same way." He looked at her. "What's happened?" She considered him across the space between their chairs. He had, She had learned over these weeks an ability to read her with an accuracy that was both useful and inconvenient, because it required a greater expenditure of energy to maintain the appearance of ordinary composure than it would have with someone less attentive. "Lady Hartmore came to see me," she said, "on Wednesday." He was still. Not the stillness of someone who has been surprised, but the stillness of someone who has been waiting for something to arrive, and it has arrived. "What did she tell you?" "About Lady Dorothea Vane." She kept her voice even, informational. "And the Marquess of Ashbourne. And your solicitors." The silence that followed was long. Julian Cavendish looked at his tea and then at the window, and then at her. And in his face, beneath the composure he maintained so consistently and so well, she saw something that she would have described, in the most precise language available to her, as the look of a man who has been living in two places at once and has just been told that both of them are visible. "It's not decided," he said. "I didn't ask whether it was decided." "No." He paused. "You didn't." He set down his cup with the careful deliberateness of a man thinking about what he is going to say next and wanting to say it correctly. "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it. She felt it land with the weight he had given it, which was considerable. "My family's interests in the northern counties are in a complicated position," he said. "There is a block of parliamentary votes that has been moving against several pieces of legislation I have spent 2 years building support for. The Marquess of Ashbourne controls a significant portion of those votes. A marriage alliance would resolve the difficulty." He looked at her directly. "I am telling you this not as an explanation, but because you deserve to know the reality of the situation I am in." "And the reality of the situation you are in," she said, with the careful steadiness she was working very hard to maintain, "is that you have been coming here twice a week while your solicitors negotiate with a marquis on your behalf." "Yes." She looked at him. Something moved through her that was not, she noted with distant clarity, what she had expected it to be. It was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more enduring than anger, the specific sorrow of a woman who has kept her expectations carefully managed and finds that she has nonetheless managed to have them. "Why are you here, Julian?" she said. The given name deliberate, matching his. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is not absence of thought but excess of it. A man attempting to say something true in a situation where truth is complicated and the words available are not equal to the thing they are being asked to carry. "Because this," he said, and stopped. Began again. "Because when I am in this room, I am thinking more clearly than I do anywhere else. Because you argue with me as though what I think matters, and also as though it might be wrong, and both of those things are rarer than they should be. Because," he stopped again. "Because," she said. "Because I came here the first time out of interest," he said. "And I have come back every time since because I cannot identify a version of Tuesday or Thursday that I would prefer to spend elsewhere." He held her eyes. "I am telling you this and also telling you that I am a man with obligations I did not choose and cannot simply set aside. And those two things are both true simultaneously, and I understand that they put you in a position that is neither fair nor simple, and he paused. "I am sorry for that. Whatever else is true, I am sorry for that." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man in her father's chair, with his good face and his careful composure, and the feeling he kept so thoroughly managed that it leaked through only in moments like this one, when the management had become too expensive to maintain. She thought about Lady Hartmore's words. "He is a man of considerable feeling," and she thought, with the clarity that comes from accepting a situation exactly as it is rather than as one would prefer it to be, that she believed him. She believed all of it, the obligation and the interest and the inadequacy of sorry to cover the distance between them. "I need to know," she said, "what you intend." He looked at her. "I don't yet know what I'm able to intend." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She stood. He stood with her, the courtesy automatic. She walked to the window and looked down at Marylebone Street below, at the afternoon, people moving through their afternoon purposes with the comfortable indifference of people whose situations are not currently requiring them to hold multiple impossible things in their hands at once. "Julian," she said, without turning, "I am going to be honest with you because you have been honest with me, and because honesty is the only thing I know how to offer you that has any real value." She paused. "I have been careful. I have been very careful these past weeks not to make more of what happens in this room than the evidence supports. I have told myself, with considerable regularity, that intellectual companionship is not a promise, and that a man's attention is not a declaration, and that I am a practical woman who understands the difference between what a thing is and what she would like it to be. She turned to look at him. I have been less successful at this exercise than I would like to admit. He looked at her with the full force of that attention he could not make ordinary, and she saw in his face, clearly, and without the useful distance of the length of a dinner table, what had been there in increments all these weeks, the thing she had been refusing to name, because names make things real in ways that cannot be unmade. Cecily, he said. I am not asking you to choose, she said. I am not in a position to ask you anything of the kind. I am asking only that you not come here twice a week if the situation is as Lady Hartmore describes it, because I find she stopped, steadied herself. I find that I am not as practical as I believed myself to be, and continuing in the current arrangement is asking more of me than I am willing to tell you it costs. The silence that followed this was the longest of all the silences the room had held, and it had held several of considerable weight. Julian Cavendish stood very still in the way he went still when he was processing something important, and looked at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, and that contained, she was almost certain, a number of things being held in tension with one another by a significant exertion of will. I hear you, he said at last. His voice was low and careful, and I will not insult you by pretending that what I feel in this room is something I can simply decide not to feel, because the timing is inconvenient. He paused. I need time, not to decide whether what I feel is real. That is not the question. The question is whether I am capable of being a man who chooses it. She held his gaze. How much time? I don't know, he said. I wish I could tell you differently. She nodded once, slowly. It was not agreement. It was acknowledgement of the truth of the situation, which was all that was being offered and which was, she told herself with the firmness of absolute necessity, enough for now. He left at 4 o'clock. She stood at the window and watched his carriage move down Marylebone Street until it turned the corner and disappeared, and she stood there a while longer after that, looking at the empty street. She told herself, managed it well. She had been honest, and she had been clear, and she had not said more than was necessary or less than was true, and she had not cried, which was a thing she was counting separately from the other accomplishments because it had required its own specific effort. She had been practical, and she had been dignified, and she had asked nothing that was unreasonable to ask. She turned from the window and sat at her mother's writing desk and opened a book at random and looked at the page without reading it. Aristotle appeared in the doorway, regarded the situation with the experienced equanimity of a cat who has witnessed human difficulty before and found it neither surprising nor particularly requiring of comment, and then crossed the room and settled on the floor beside her feet with the weighted warmth of an animal who has decided that presence is the appropriate response. Yes, she said to him quietly. Quite. The letter came 3 days later. It was not from Julian. It was from her father's older brother, her uncle Gerard, who had been largely absent from her life since her father's death, not from unkindness, but from the deep preoccupation with his own affairs that had always characterized his relationship with the branch of the family from which Cecily descended. He wrote from his estate in Shropshire, in the cramped, efficient hand of a man who considers correspondence a practical instrument rather than a social art, and the letter's contents, which she read standing at her writing desk with her coat still on from the morning walk, required 2 readings before she was satisfied she had understood them correctly. Her uncle was coming to London. He would be in town for 3 weeks. He wished to discuss certain matters pertaining to her father's estate. He had engaged a solicitor. There were questions of some complexity regarding a property in Shropshire, a small estate that had been part of the Ashworth family holdings for 2 generations and which had not, as it turned out, been properly included in the assessment of her father's debts, and which was, her uncle's letter implied with the careful indirection of a man who has spoken to lawyers, potentially hers. She read it a 3rd time. The property was called Vellacott. She had been there once, as a child, for a summer. She remembered a house with white walls and a garden that smelled of lavender and a kitchen with a blue-painted door. She remembered it as a place that had felt, even to a child too young to articulate the feeling, like somewhere that belonged to her in a way that her father's rented houses in Oxford never quite had. She sat down at the writing desk. She set the letter beside the inkwell. She thought about Vellacott and about Marylebone Street, and about the Duke of Wyndmere and his solicitors and the Marquess of Ashbourne's daughter. She thought about time and what it meant and who she was beneath the room above the bookshop and the borrowed earrings and the 4 months of careful management. She thought, if Vellacott is mine, I have somewhere to go. I have somewhere I belong. I have a ground beneath my feet that is not borrowed. And with this thought came another, quieter and more unsettling, which was that the woman who had walked into Julian Cavendish's dining room by accident and sat down and argued about political economy had done so as someone with nothing to lose. And the woman she was becoming, over these weeks of twice-weekly visits and careful management and insufficient practicality, was not that woman. She had begun to have something to lose, and the having of it was making her smaller, more careful, more inclined to manage herself out of her own actual feelings for fear of the cost of feeling them. She did not like this. She did not like it with the quiet, absolute clarity of a woman who has identified something true about herself and cannot unknow it. She wrote back to her uncle the same afternoon. She would meet him at his solicitor's offices on Monday. She would learn what was or was not hers. She would proceed from there. She did not write to Julian. She did not know what to write. He did not come on the following Tuesday. She told herself she had expected this. She sat in her chair by the window with her book and read it properly for once, the full length of the afternoon, and when 2 o'clock came and passed without a knock at the street door, she noted it and continued reading and did not go to the window more than twice. The meeting with her uncle's solicitor on Monday established that Vellacott was hers, subject to certain formalities that would require several weeks to conclude, but which were, the solicitor indicated with the careful confidence of a man who has examined a question from every angle and found it solid, unlikely to present difficulty. The estate was small, a house of moderate size with 6 acres of garden and farmland and a tenancy arrangement with a local family that had been in place for 30 years and which produced a modest but reliable income. It was not wealth. It was sufficiency and sufficiency, Cecily thought, walking home from the solicitor's offices through the November afternoon with her uncle at her side, discussing the details with the practical enthusiasm of a man who is glad to have done something useful for a relation, was considerably more than she had had 3 days ago. She told Mrs. Beale that evening. Mrs. Beale received the information with the warm satisfaction of a woman who had always thought Cecily deserved better than 2 rooms and was glad to see the world organizing itself accordingly. She told Lady Hartmore on Wednesday, when Lady Hartmore called. Lady Hartmore received it with the composed approval of a woman who considers property a reasonable basis for security and does not pretend otherwise. She told no one else. On Thursday morning, she was sitting at her mother's writing desk working on a letter to her father's colleagues in Oxford about the manuscripts when she heard a carriage on the street below and looked up and looked away again with the deliberate self-discipline of a woman who has decided not to do the thing she is about to do, and then looked back. It was his carriage. It was not Tuesday or Thursday. It was Thursday morning, which was not 2 o'clock and was not the appointed time, and the carriage stopped in front of the bookshop, and the door opened, and Julian Cavendish stepped out onto Marylebone Street, and looked up at the window, and she was there, and he could see her, and she could see him, and the world paused for a moment on the hinge of what happened next. She went to the door of her rooms and opened it before Mrs. Beale could knock. He came up the stairs 2 at a time with the contained urgency of a man who has been making a decision for 3 days and has arrived at it, and is not interested in further delay. He came through the sitting-room door and stopped. He was not composed in the way she was accustomed to seeing him composed. He was still himself, still the Duke of Wyndmere in every visible particular, but there was something beneath the surface of him that had shifted, some arrangement that had changed in the interval since she had last seen him. He said, "I told the Marquess of Ashbourne that there would be no marriage." She looked at him. When, 3 days ago, on Tuesday morning, he held her gaze. "Before I was supposed to come here at 2 o'clock. I spent the rest of Tuesday deciding whether I was going to tell you what I'd done or whether the fact of it was sufficient and you didn't need to know the mechanics. And I decided," he said, "that you have been the most honest person in this situation throughout, and you deserve to know all of it. Not the edited version. All of it." She was very still. "All of it," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said, with the simple declarative force of a man for whom this is a fact rather than an announcement, since the 3rd Thursday of October, When you told me my reading of Burke's conception of natural rights was internally inconsistent and then proved it with 3 separate citations from the text itself. He paused. I spent 2 weeks after that trying to determine whether what I felt was genuine or whether it was the novelty of a conversation I found unusually engaging. I spent another 2 weeks after that telling myself that it was genuine, but that it was not actionable because of the Marquess and the parliamentary votes and the obligation, and he stopped. Something moved through his face that was more unguarded than anything she had seen there before. And I spent last week after you told me honestly what it was costing you understanding that I had been using the word obligation as a way of not being brave enough to admit what I wanted. Cecily stood in the middle of her sitting room and looked at the man who had been to her wrong house by her wrong counting and stayed, and then come back, twice a week, in the face of all the reasons not to, and the thing she had been managing so carefully for 3 months became, in the space of a breath, simply impossible to manage. You should sit down, she said, because she needed a moment. I don't want to sit down, he said. I want you to tell me whether I've destroyed this entirely by taking too long to do what I should have done 6 weeks ago. She looked at him. She thought about Vellacott and the lavender garden and the blue-painted door and the fact that she was going to have ground beneath her feet that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary. She thought about the woman she had been managing herself into, smaller and more careful than the one who had walked through the wrong door and sat down and picked up the correct spoon. She thought about what it meant to have nothing to lose and what it meant to choose something anyway. You haven't destroyed it, she said. You've made it considerably more complicated. He took a breath. Is complicated survivable? She looked at him steadily, with the full, direct, unhurried attention she had learned from her father and applied to everything that mattered. Ask me something easier, she said. And then, before he could speak again, she said, Yes, Julian. Complicated is survivable. I have been surviving it for 3 months without your assistance. Surviving it together seems considerably more promising. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands, both of them, and held them with the careful, absolute care of a man holding something he is determined not to damage by gripping too hard. He looked at her from the distance of nothing, from the distance of the 4 inches that had been between them for 3 months, and was now no longer there. I have a great deal to make right, he said. With you and with the situation I put you in. I am aware of that. You do, she agreed. We can begin on that immediately. Can I begin, he said, very quietly, by asking if I may come to dinner. Not my dinner. Yours. Whatever Mrs. Beale provides. Whatever the evening looks like here. She looked at him. The room above the bookshop, small and plain and full of books, with her mother's teapot and Aristotle at the door and the view of Marylebone Street that was gray and ordinary and entirely hers. Tuesday, she said. 6 o'clock. He was still holding her hands when Aristotle appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation with the thoroughness of long experience, and sat down in the threshold with the proprietary calm of an animal who has decided this development meets with his approval. Neither of them looked at the cat. Neither of them needed to. He came to dinner on Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and on the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. He came in November and through December and into the new year, and each time he arrived at the door of the bookshop on Marylebone Street, he brought nothing except himself, which was, Cecily had decided, precisely enough. The world noticed. The world, which had spent the better part of 4 months looking past Cecily Ashworth at things it found more interesting, turned around and looked at her properly for the first time, and found, to its visible surprise, that there was considerably more to look at than it had previously accounted for. Lady Hartmore reported, with unconcealed satisfaction, that the dinner tables of Mayfair were engaged in the unprecedented exercise of reassessing a woman they had collectively failed to see. The women who had greeted Cecily with the sudden warmth of revised importance now greeted her with something that approached genuine interest, which she accepted with the equanimity of a person who has learned the difference between being seen and being found useful and is not confused about which she prefers. Julian proposed in February, at Vellacott, in the lavender garden that still smelled of lavender even in the cold of winter, dormant and waiting and entirely itself. He did it without theater, without performance, with the plain directness that was the most essential thing about him. He said that he loved her and that he wished to spend the rest of his life arguing with her, and that he was aware this was not a conventional inducement, but that he hoped it would be received in the spirit in which it was intended. She said yes before he had finished the sentence, because she had known what she was going to say since November and saw no reason to make him wait longer than necessary for an answer she had already reached. They were married in April, in the small church near Vellacott, with her Uncle Gerard in the front pew wearing an expression of gratified surprise, and Lady Hartmore in the second row wearing her emeralds at 10 in the morning because she had decided they were appropriate, and no one was going to tell her otherwise. The wedding was not large. It was not grand. It was, by the standards of what marrying a duke might reasonably have required, remarkably quiet. Julian had wanted it that way. Cecily had wanted it that way. The world could form its opinions afterward. At the breakfast that followed, someone asked Cecily how they had met. She said she had walked into the wrong house. Julian, standing beside her with his hand at the small of her back and the look on his face that she had learned to read as the thing he kept most carefully contained and which was therefore, when it appeared, the truest thing about him, said that it was the most fortunate misdirection in his recent memory. Lady Hartmore, overhearing this, said that in 40 years of attending weddings she had never heard a better answer and that she intended to repeat it everywhere. Cecily looked at the man beside her. The man who had let her stay, who had come back, who had chosen her over the easier and more obvious path, who had sat in her late father's chair and argued about Burke with the intensity of someone who had found, unexpectedly, the one room in London where he was most entirely himself. She thought about the wrong door and the correct spoon and the cold tea and the cat in the threshold and all the small, ordinary, accidental things that had assembled themselves, without asking her permission, into this specific and irreplaceable life. She thought, some doors are wrong in exactly the right way. And then she stopped thinking about it, because Julian was saying something quietly into her ear that required her full attention, and the morning was bright, and the lavender garden outside the window was beginning, in the cautious, incremental way of things that know what they are and do not need to hurry about it, to bloom. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.